My name is John Passfield, and I'm going to read some short passages from my novel, Pauline Johnson, Know Who I Am, and two poems by Pauline Johnson. The book that I will read from is Flint and Feather by E. Pauline Johnson. And the title of this reading will be Video 17, Pauline's Poems, number 3. The poem that I will read first is very stark and very blunt. The poem Wolverine presents a racial divide. There's a passage on Wolverine in my novel on page 77. I shouldn't have took the horse. We too could have rode on its back. At least then we would have had an equal chance. Them wolves was howling fit to be tied. No way I could have crossed that river. That ice was all broke up and the current was way too fast. He shouldn't have told me to take his horse. I shouldn't have left him there behind. Them wolves was howling, and every drop of my blood was on fire. And then here's the poem, Wolverine. It's on page 24 of Flint and Feather by E. Pauline Johnson, as she called herself when she printed her poems. Wolverine. Yes, sir, it's quite a story, though you won't believe it's true. But such things happen often when I lived beyond the Sioux, and the trapper tilted back his chair and filled his pipe anew. I ain't thought of it neither for this many and many a day, although it used to haunt me in the years that slid away, the years I spent a-trappin' for the good old Hudson's Bay. Wild? You bet. 'Twas wild then, and few and far between the squatters' shacks, for whites was scarce as furs when things is green, and only reds and Hudson's Bay men was all the folk I seen. No, them old Indians ain't so bad, not if you treat 'em square. Why, I lived in amongst 'em all the winters I was there, and I never lost a copper, and I never lost a hair. But I'd have lost my life the time that you'd heard tell about. I don't think I'd be sitting here, but dead, beyond a doubt, if that there Indian Wolverine just hadn't helped me out. 'Twas fresh at time, way back as long as 66 or 68, and I was coming to the post that year kind of late, for beaver had been plentiful and trapping had been great. One day I'd been setting traps along a bit of wood, and night was catching up to me just faster than it should, but all at once I heard a sound that curdled up my blood. It was a howl of famished wolves. I didn't stop to think, but just lit out across for home as quick as you could wink. But when I reached the river's edge, I brought up at the brink. That morning I had crossed the stream straight on a sheet of ice, and now, God help me, there it was churning up and cracked to dice. The flood went boiling past. I stood like one shut in a vice. No way ahead, no path aback, trapped like a rat ashore, with naught but death to follow, and with naught but death afore. The howl of hungry wolves aback, ahead, the torrent's roar. And then a voice, an Indian voice, that called out clear and clean, "Take Indian's horse, I run like deer, wolf can't catch Wolverine." I says, thank heaven. There stood the chief I'd nicknamed Wolverine. I leapt on that there horse, and then, just like a coward, fled, and left that Indian standing there alone, as good as dead, with the wolves a-howling at his back, the swollen stream ahead. I don't know how them Indians dodge from death the way they do. You won't believe it, sir, but what I'm telling you is true. But that there chap was round next day, as sound as me and you. He came to get his horse, but not a cent he'd take from me. Yes, sir, you're right. The Indians now ain't like they used to be. We've got 'em sharpened up a bit, and now they'll take a fee. No, sir, you're wrong. They ain't no dogs. I'm not through telling yet. You'll take that name right back, or else just out you get. You'll take that name right back when you hear all the yearn, I bet. It happened the same autumn, when some whites was coming, and I heard the old Red River carts a-kicking up a din, so I went over to their camp to see an English skin. They said they'd had an awful scare from Injuns, and they swore that savages had come around the very night before a-brandishing their tomahawks and painted up for war. But when their plucky Englishman had put a bit of lead right through the heart of one of them and rolled him over dead, the other cowards said that they'd come on peace instead, that they, the whites, had lost some stores from off their little pack. And then the red they peppered dead had followed up their track because he'd found the packages and came to give 'em back. Oh, they said. They were quite sorry, but it wasn't like as if they had killed a decent white man by mistake or in a tiff. It was only some old Injun dog that lay there stark and stiff. I said, "You are the meanest dogs that ever yet I seen." Then I rolled the body over as it lay out on the green. I peered into the face. My God, 'twas poor old Wolverine. Well, that's the first poem. The second poem is also mentioned, thought of by Pauline Johnson in my novel. And here's the passage that refers to as Red Men Die in my novel. It's on page 53. I work my way through the list. So Gisto, As Red Men Die, A Cry from an Indian Wife. My Indian segment is the more powerful of the two. I want him to see what I can see. I want him to feel what I can feel. But it isn't all war whoops and blood and revenge and pride. There's a lyric note to the evening. All is quiet. A pin could drop. Then I lead them through the song my paddle sings. The river slips through its silent bed. Someone told me that poem is almost like a hymn. Well, let's go to page 6 then of Flint and Feather. For As Red Men Die, a poem by Pauline Johnson. Captive, is there a hell to him like this? A taunt more galling than the Huron's hiss? He, proud and scornful, he who laughed at law, he, seeing of the deadly Iroquois, he the bloodthirsty, he the Mohawk chief, he who despises pain and sneers at grief. Here, in the hated Huron's vicious clutch, that even captive he disdains to touch. Captive, but never conquered, Mohawk brave stoops not to be to any man a slave, least to the puny tribe his soul abhors, the tribe whose wigwam sprinkles Simcoe's shores. With scowling brow he stands and courage high, watching with haughty and defiant eye his captors as they counsel o'er his fate, or strive his boldness to intimidate. Then fling they unto him the choice. Wilt thou walk o'er the bed of fire that waits thee now? Walk with uncovered feet upon the coals until thou reach the ghostly land of souls, and with thy Mohawk death song please our ear? Or wilt thou with the women rest thee here? His eyes flash like an eagle's and his hands clench at the insult. Like a god he stands. Prepare the fire, he scornfully demands. He knoweth that his same jeering band will bite the dust, will lick the Mohawk's hand, will kneel and cower at the Mohawk's feet, will shrink when Mohawk war drums wildly beat. His death will be avenged with hideous hate by Iroquois, swift to annihilate his vile, detested captors that now flaunt their war clubs in his face with sneer and taunt, not thinking soon that reeking red and raw their scalps will deck the belts of Iroquois. The path of coals outstretches, white with heat, a forest fir's length ready for his feet. Unflinching as a rock, he steps along the burning mass and sings his wild war song. Sings as he sang when once he used to roam throughout the forests of his southern home, where down the Genesee the water roars, where gentle Mohawk purls between its shores. Songs that of exploit and of prowess tell, songs of the Iroquois, invincible. Up the long trail of fire he boasting goes, dancing a war dance to defy his foes. His flesh is scorched, his muscles burn and shrink, but still he dances to death's awful brink. The eagle plume that crests his haughty head will never droop until his heart be dead. Slower and slower, yet his footstep swings, wilder and wilder still, his death song rings. Fiercer and fiercer through the forest bounds his voice that leaps to happier hunting grounds, one savage yell. Then loyal to his race, he bends to death, but never to disgrace. So, what do we make of such poems? And responding to such poems, I think it's important to consider that Pauline Johnson is an equal member of two different races and is writing from that unique double perspective. In each of these poems we find two races, two tribes, two groups, two societies at odds. There's also a separate male-female dynamic in the Pauline Johnson poems, which is interesting to keep in mind as well. In one poem there's a triangle. Two men of separate races are harmonious to the point where one will sacrifice his safety for another, and the one who panics feels guilty at having left a fellow human in danger. In a subsequent episode, some people are so racist that they shoot an approaching person of another race because they assume that anyone of that race must be a thief. These people are then denounced as racist by one of their own race. In another poem, members of two groups who see themselves as enemies face each other in the person of a captive and his captors. The captor submits to torture rather than humiliation and reassures himself in compensation that his own people will wreak violence on his captors in response to the cruelty that they are showing to him. I think that we are at a crossroads, not only in Canada, but in the world of today, the world of this decade and of the year 2022. We can deny history, not read such stark and blunt depictions of blatant racial animosity, or we can read of such incidents in the past and see them as our common tragic history, not only of Canada, but of the entire world, of Europe, of Asia, and the Americas, when all people were tribalists, and when suspicion of the other was not only embedded in the cultures of all peoples, but racial hostility towards others was seen as a survival tactic in a world where all tribes seemed to be hostile, and the survival of one's own tribe appeared to depend on the defeat of the neighboring tribes. Lost my point here. The neighboring threatening tribes. The tribalist urge has survived, unfortunately, beyond the time when all tribes were struggling for survival, when each felt that their own survival depended on the defeat of the other tribes, white or Asian or Aboriginal, who were competing for the necessities of life. We now live in a world, we are told, and we see the evidence, in which the survival of all of us, certainly the assurance of our comfort and our prosperity, depends on the cooperation of all the communities, the tribes, the societies, the races of the whole world. Hopefully, we can admit the truth of our history without using it as a means of nurturing hatred in those who are young and those who are yet unborn. Will they come into a world in which our history of tribal hatreds is taught to them as a means of seeing their own tribe as innocent and other tribes as threatening? Or will they be born into a world in which the chief identifying characteristic of themselves and others is that we are all human, with our differences being seen as enjoyable and to be celebrated, but ultimately as minor variations from humanity, the common race, the common society, the common tribe? Well, the two books that I've been reading from are John Passfield, Know Who I Am, which is a novel which I wrote, and Flint and Feather by Pauline Johnson, a collection of her poems. So thank you for watching this video.